apocalyptic orange glow of skies stained by wildfire. And every Canadian can share the heartbreak of our firefighters falling in the line of duty, mass evacuations of entire communities that are all too often Indigenous, and the heartbreak of one little boy in BC losing his life to unrelenting asthma triggered by wildfire smoke. So what does all this have to do with Mr. Torrie's presentation on powering Ontario's growth? Well, just about everything. We stand at the cusp of two starkly different futures as governments strive to keep up the energy supplies that power every aspect of our lives. Jurisdictions around the world are racing to electrify everything and decarbonize their electricity grids for a thriving, sustainable future. But here in Ontario, our government is inexplicably ignoring clean, affordable, renewable energy options to push against the public interest. In the midst of a climate emergency driven by fossil fuels, Ontario plans to massively increase the burning of gas, itself a fossil fuel, and expand expensive, risky nuclear options to generate electricity. By joining tonight, you'll learn about the superior alternatives and upholding the public interest in our energy future. Let's hear now from Gail with a land acknowledgement to reflect for a moment on the true stewardship of this land.
We acknowledge that we are settlers on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. We give thanks today to the Haudenosaunee Confederacy for the seventh generation principle that requires the decisions that we make today result in a sustainable world 7 generations into the future. The Haudenosaunee respect the world in which they live as they are only borrowing it from future generations. Can we envision how the seventh generation principle might guide decisions in Ontario, where mining for minerals, logging, and paving over farmland is justified by the Ontario government in the name of progress, green energy, housing development, and economic growth? Following the seventh generation principles requires that we ask difficult questions about sustainability, biodiversity, loss, justice, and equity. The Indigenous principles of the honorable harvest can instruct us whether we are harvesting trees, farming, or mining for minerals. They are. Never take the first, never take the last. Harvest in a way that minimizes harm. Take only what you need and leave the rest for others. Use everything that you take. If we follow these principles, we will ask, what will the land, the water, and the forest look like after harvesting trees or mining for lithium or paving over farmland? Will the forest be abundant and in good health for the next 100 years? Will the animals, plants, clean water, and fertile soil be abundant for 7 generations to come? Are we taking too much? Will there be abundance left for us humans as well as our non-human relations? Finding the answers requires us to learn from Indigenous nations and support Indigenous land, water, air defenders who are on the front line of many climate conflicts. These conflicts include the Jinogaming First Nation in the Thunder Bay area that is seeking a court injunction to prevent mineral exploration in its traditional territory, pending the outcome of a lawsuit against Ontario and 2 mining companies. The Wet'suwet'en, who are leading the fight to stop the Coastal Gas Link pipeline. A coalition of 9 nations fighting to protect the breathing lands from mining. They are taking Ontario and Canada to court to press for co-jurisdiction in Treaty 9 territory, giving them greater decision-making power over resource extraction on their lands. On September 27th, 5 nations from Northern Ontario, including Grassy Narrows, will come to Toronto to lead a Land Alliance march, calling on Premier Ford to end unwanted mining activity in their territories. If you can, Please join them at Grange Park on Wednesday at 12 noon.
Thank you, Gail, for a beautiful, thoughtful, and informative land acknowledgement. A lot of food for thought there. I now have the pleasure of introducing my fellow OCEC colleague, Bob Garthson, who will moderate the Q&A later in this program and was instrumental, along with our incredible team, in organizing tonight's event. As you'll gather from the extensive list of Bob's affiliations and activities, he is an astonishingly accomplished person with wide-ranging interests and expertise. The person who always gets the job done, yet manages to do so with such humility and kindness. Bob is an agroecologist, organic and regenerative farmer. Currently a retired educator, he is a life member and former vice president of the Ontario Secondary Teachers Federation. He has been a longtime organizer at the local, provincial, national, and international levels, and in a variety of contexts since 1967. The OCEC, Council of Canadians, SCAN, the Northumberland Coalition, Fair Share Food Bank, Dryland Solutions, and National Farmers Union, as well as Qigong, are Bob's main organizational and recreational commitments at this time. Quite a full quiver there. And with that, I will turn it over to Bob.
Thank you, Millie. We are all eventually monarch butterflies, according to Indigenous legend. I think of us present as members of the community of Mother Earth, committed to sharing this evening what can be done to achieve clean energy. What must be done with concentrated actions to achieve our desired outcomes. I believe that without promoting justice for all, success is at most uncertain. We in so-called Canada, in quotes, must do our part. And after the webinar, please share your thoughts, questions, and actions with me and others in your organization beyond this evening. Lynn will present some actions for you to consider. For me, I consider the climate crisis to be very personal, one that requires thorough research, strategizing, and continuous prolonged action without fear of reprisals. And I concur with Ralph's final words in an email he sent to me. I quote, "Canadians have a particular responsibility to listen and learn from First Nations and to renew our connections to the land that sustains us." One of my earliest political actions occurred in 1969-71 when I was researching and writing my master's thesis on Indigenous white relations in the 19th century. And I organized a coalition for social justice as a result of two discoveries. First, the federal government wanted to abolish the Indian Act and hand over authority and responsibility to the provinces. Protests resulted, and it did not happen. Second, it was revealed that the Indigenous people of the English Wabigoon area of Grassy Narrows in Northwest Ontario were suffering severely from mercury poisoning, resulting from the mining in the area and them eating the local fish. The government's proposed solution, in quotes, only eat store-bought fish. That's what they said to them. After many years of testing, this is personal, I was informed that I had heavy metal and mercury poisoning from coal and dental work with mercury. Two credible and scientific sources, the Lancet and the JAMA Network, document the connection between fossil fuels and illness. And I quote, heat exposure causes widespread healthy harms, including adverse mental health outcomes such as mood and anxiety disorders, schizophrenia, and increased suicide risk, and worsening sleep. My son has schizophrenia. We do not have the luxury of despair. As my good friend Maud Barlow wrote in her book, Still Hopeful, resilience, determination, careful planning, and kindness can lead to positive results. The 7 generations yet to be born are counting on us. It's my great pleasure to be able to introduce my friend Ralph Torrie, and we will tell you about the rest of the agenda in a minute. Ralph Torrie is Director of Research for Corporate Knights, a Toronto-based research and publishing company focused on the role of business in the sustainability transition. He has 45 years of experience in the energy and environment space and has been actively involved in the climate change issue since 1988. He grew up and lives in Cobourg and was a candidate for the Northumberland Quinte West Green Party in the federal elections of 2008 and 2011. Ralph, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Bob. I will share my screen now, hopefully. Plug and pray, as they say. Did that come up? Oh. Are we good?
Yep. It's on, Ralph.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone who's already spoken. A great deal of wisdom has already been transferred and shared here. And looking over the participants this evening, I'm genuinely humbled. I recognize a number of not only friends, but teachers of mine over the years. And would happily just listen to others on this call speak for the next hour. But I'm also quite happy to share with you a few thoughts that are connected to the Ontario electricity situation. I'm not going to jump right into that specific topic. I did want to spend a little bit of time on context because we are lost. And we need to find ourselves if we are going to navigate a way out of the very dangerous waters that we are now literally encountering as climate change gathers momentum and nature begins to show us the force and the power that is unleashed when we don't live within the basically the house rules of this place. I do believe, to follow up on the comments about hope a moment ago, that we are in the early pages of a new chapter in the human story that will be a transition. I wouldn't say the likes of which we've never seen before, but it's certainly on a scale with the Copernican revolution and other big turning points in our story where we've had to rethink where we belong in the scheme of things. This was, and if you'll just indulge me, I won't spend too long on wandering off into these philosophical points, but these kinds of ideas are what help keep me focused on the changes that we need and the changes that we and the methods and the strategies that are going to be required to get there. This is a map of the world, about the best map of the world that one could find in 1490 from a European perspective. There is no idea that a continent lies between the European continent and the Orient. And when the first Europeans set out sailing westward, expecting that they would eventually arrive at the Orient because they knew the world was round. That had not been an issue for many, many centuries. They didn't have any maps. They didn't have any charts. They had to basically find their way forward using fundamental principles of navigation, sailing by the stars, essentially, and believing that if they did that, that they would arrive at their destination safely. This map, 17 years only later. Again, from a European perspective, the North American continent has begun to show up in the understanding of the Western or the European world of what lay out there. But it would be another several decades before a complete mapping of the physical globe would be finished. And as any Australian will tell you, this is, of course, the way that we understand the world today. And it's funny, I don't know about you, but if I look at this map long enough, I actually get a bit of a headache. So ingrained, at least for me, is the way that we think about the world. And of course, everybody knows Canada's on the top, Antarctica's on the bottom. And when you see it presented this way, even though this is every bit as topographically and physically correct as the map that we're more familiar with, it can be quite disorienting. This is the kind of situation we find ourselves in again today, as for the first time, we are trying to come to grips with an understanding of what it means to live in a finite, round, and spherical world. This is the age of the circle, as a colleague of mine was saying to me in a conversation the other day. So it sounds like I'm a long way from electricity in Ontario. I'm not really, but let me start to draw what I think are the connections between this introduction and where we need to get to on the electricity agenda in this province. This is a fairly fairly commonly used portrayal of the relationship between the environment and the economy and society. Countless textbooks on sustainable development. Whoops, something just went wrong, right? Bear with me. Just while that's coming up, I'll just continue. Countless textbooks will use this Venn diagram to try and explain the concept of sustainable development. They're all wrong. It implies a physically impossible relationship. I really apologize for this. Maybe I better just pause and get this sorted out. You're seeing the cluttered contents of my hard drive. I really don't know what happened there. Sorry, hopefully it won't happen again. For example, if you look at the part of the economy that exists outside of the environment, over here in the upper right where the piggy bank is, what on earth could that possibly represent? What part of the human economy exists outside of the environment? And you can ask similar questions as you go around this Venn diagram about these strange spaces that exist outside of the physical environment, including parts of society and parts of the economy. And it's this dominance of the economic frame, if you like, which has got us into the trouble that we're in. This is a somewhat noisy graph. On the upper part of it, there are a number of bars that show ranges of parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere. We're somewhere between 450 and 550 right now. We're in the bottom part, it shows the average global temperature change relative to the pre-industrial age that one can expect to go along with the concentrations represented in the top part. And each one of these arrows, which get progressively more red as the consequences get more serious, represents the types of ecological impacts that we can expect to see from climate change. This graph, by the way, I've been using for nearly 20 years without changing it. The global climatological community has been remarkably accurate in their predictions and their understanding of what the consequences of destabilizing the climate would be to ecosystems in terms of extreme weather events, wildfires, floods, droughts, heat waves. And it just, as you can see, continues to get worse and worse the higher we go in terms of increasing the average global temperature. We have to stop burning stuff. We have to stop burning fossil fuels in particular, but we've got a real problem with combustion and the consequences that it is unleashing and the public health, human security, not to mention economic consequences of the results that we've triggered by carrying on as if there were no limits, as if there was no ecological boundaries which need to be respected in the course of human affairs. Where we need to go needs to be informed, I would suggest, by a diagram that looks more like this. That recognizes that the human economy is contained, is only part of the larger phenomenon of human society, which itself is completely enveloped by the natural environment in which we all live and on which all of our communities and all of our economies are embedded and totally dependent. If you start behaving as we have been doing, as if you can grow this economy without regard to those limits, that's when you will start to see the consequences of an unbalanced natural world. And as it tries to bring itself back into balance, the consequences to human civilizations are quite severe. We've just had a taste of it this summer here in North America. Other countries, particularly in South Asia, are already well familiar with the angry face of a destabilized global climate. Here you see history. This graph needs updating, but essentially this is the history of primary fuel and electricity use in this country going back over 140 years or 50 years. And it's basically the story of our society and our economy can be seen in the different stages that we've gone through with our energy system. The black is coal at the bottom, the red is oil, the yellow is natural gas, the blue is hydropower, the green is biomass, and the purple at the top is nuclear energy. And you can think about different historical events, whether it's the Great Depression in around this period, or the post-war boom right around here, or the continued growth throughout the 70s and 80s in which many of us grew up, or the stabilization and slight decline that we have begun to see over the past 20 years in our energy system. The story of our our story is largely reflected in the story of our energy system, as you would expect, and as ecologists would tell you, that the flow of energy through a system is what organizes that system. What happened, as is reflected again in a graph that needs updating, but the lines have continued on a course like this, is that while our economic output has continued to grow, that's the blue line, and our population has continued to grow, that's the straight green line, our fuel and electricity use, which used to grow pretty much in lockstep with the economy up until about 1970, 71, even into the 1970s, started to fall away from the economy. And herein is the first connection I want to make with what's gone wrong with electricity planning and electricity thinking in Ontario, not just in Ontario, but in many places. Most of the electricity planners, most of the economic specialists whose job it has been to think about what type of future electricity system we need, grew up and were educated and had their understanding of the world created during this extraordinary period between World War II and 1970, where it might have appeared that the norm was for more and more fuel and electricity use to be an absolute essential requirement of more and more human population growth and more human economic activity. But in fact, that was an extraordinarily unusual period. It's more common, especially in a capitalist society, for there to be pressure to create more output with less input. That's the normal state of affairs. And that's what's been happening since about the early 70s. And this has really been one of the things that has saved the situation from being much worse than it would otherwise be. But it didn't stop, and I'll come back to this in a minute. It didn't stop a whole generation of utility planners thinking that the only way you could keep the lights on and maintain a healthy economy in Ontario would be to maintain electricity growth that followed the blue line. And so the electricity planning forecasts that characterized the mid-1970s, and which unfortunately have continued to characterize forecasts that have come out of that industry in the late 1980s, in the early 2000s, and now most recently in the way that they think about responding to climate change, continue to show exponential growth in electricity consumption that is way out of proportion to what is necessary, to what is feasible, to what is affordable, and to what is ecologically sustainable. In general, after this 150-year binge that we've been on of burning fossil fuels, we need to start reducing those fuels at about the same rate that they grew if we are going to get anywhere in the neighborhood of zero emissions by mid-century. The great thing about a challenge like this, by the way, is that it's so obvious that it requires a break from tradition, that it requires innovation beyond business as usual, that it's very stimulating for thinking about fresh approaches and strategies, which is what I've been doing for most of the last 40 years. So there's a consensus that's emerged, started developing about 15 years ago. It's quite strong now, that there are a small number of things that absolutely must characterize any successful response to the climate change crisis. First of all, we must use energy more efficiently, and we must find ways to get the things that we need and that we want so that we require less fuel and electricity to do so. That's partly efficiency, but it's partly just being innovative and clever in the way we get the things we really care about, which is comfort and security and health and knowledge and happiness. That's about it, those 5 things. That's what drives the whole machine. Everybody agrees. There's differences of opinion about how the extent of electrification, but everybody that works in this field agrees that there will be a much greater role for electricity in a successful transition away from fossil fuels. Historically, we only really used electricity in most places if we had to use it. We used it for lights, we used it for small motors, we used it obviously for mechanical and electrochemical processes. But by and large, unless you were in a place like Quebec or Norway, where you had, or British Columbia, where you had lots and lots of electricity to spare, its role was restricted primarily to those things which really required electricity. And it didn't provide much, hardly any transportation. And it had limited application in the provision of space heat and heat at higher temperatures. Again, with the exception of some places where there was so much cheap electricity that it has been used extensively for space heating. But in the response to climate change, electricity will move into the transportation market. It's already happening, as many of you know. I'm sure some of you have already made that transition in your personal transportation. And it will also be central to the provision of heat of all temperatures in the future, although in some surprising ways that I'll mention in a moment. Of course, if we're going to do this, the electricity supply itself is going to have to be decarbonized. We can't be making electricity with fossil fuels if we want to get to that zero emission future by electrifying end uses. This is one of the biggest and most this is one of the most contentious areas of the climate change futures that are facing us, or the climate change response strategies that we have to choose from. Is yes, we have to decarbonize the electricity supply. What's the best way? What's the most effective way? What's the cheapest way? And what's the way of doing that that's going to be most supportive for the development of healthy and prosperous communities? And that's where we have a big gap between the vision that's being put forward by for example, the independent electricity system operator, which is basically the instrument of government policy and planning for electricity in Ontario, and the alternative vision that we see reflected in the dozens and dozens of community-based climate change response strategies that are popping up all over the province and all over the world. And I will be coming back to that all-important role of local agency and municipal governments in responding to this problem. A fourth element of the response to climate change is that there will probably be, and there's also disagreement over this, but there will probably be a role, an ongoing role for the use of biomass-based energy, whether it's liquid fuel or wood, but it's got to be done in the context of sustainable relationships with the forests and with the agricultural lands, or it just doesn't work, and it won't be sustainable. And I would say that just even in the last 10 or 15 years, as the price of renewable electricity has come down and down, the price of storage has come down and down, the number of instances in the economy where people say there isn't an electrification strategy that's going to work there has gotten smaller and smaller. But biofuels most likely will have a role in this future, at least in the medium term, especially in some industrial applications and in long distance trucking and long distance shipping and long distance air. Short distance, it's interesting, short distance trucking, short distance shipping, and even short distance airplanes now have quite good prospects for electrification. I was watching the new electric ferry in Kingston when I was visiting there a couple of weeks ago. And of course, ferries and short haul boats are electrifying in Europe, and fishing fleets will be electrifying. But for the long haul transatlantic and trans-Pacific shipping, as well as for long haul air travel, even though we now have short distance electric airplanes. We will continue to be challenged in how we can do that with sustainable fuels. Finally, even if you do all these things, if you get the efficiency and the electrification of end uses and the decarbonation of the electricity supply and the right contribution from sustainable biofuels, we still are going to need to push innovation hard to find ways to reduce the energy intensity of the way that we provide the things that we need, human needs and amenities. This sounds a little maybe not very clear, but what I'm talking about here is a point that I alluded to briefly a few moments ago, that what we really want, nobody wants electricity, by the way. Anytime somebody uses the phrase the demand for electricity, remember, there is no demand for electricity. Nobody wants a kilowatt hour in their hands, believe me. The demand is actually derived from an underlying set of demands for services, for heat and information transfer and light. And even those are derived from that very short list of fundamental human needs and amenities, which is health, security, information, comfort, and happiness, really. And when innovation, whether it's something like the internet or telepresence technology, develops ways where we can get those things without having to use as much fuel and electricity in the first place, that's a powerful and has already been a very, very large contributor to the reason why fuel and electricity consumption is slowing down. And we have to keep pushing that lever as well. So those are the pillars of the transition. There are some wicked complications. As we've been reminded all too clearly this summer, climate change is going to increase no matter how much progress we make in turning down the fossil fuel. And the more progress we made, the less serious will be those growing consequences. As I showed earlier, it will never be the case that it's too late to reduce emissions. It will always be the case, as they say, that every degree matters, every fraction of a degree matters. Every bit that we can do to turn down the driving force of this climate change will lessen the consequences of deleterious climate change in the future. But it's going to get expensive. As the cost of these floods and fires, just in dollars, which seems like a feeble metric considering the price that we're now paying in human life and suffering in places like Pakistan and Hawaii, and even here in Canada this past summer. These costs are probably already larger than what we devote to trying to prevent the problem. And certainly in the future, the overall burden that climate change is going to present to us will look increasingly much, much larger than the effort and the cost of addressing the problem and mitigating the emissions. Nature is an independent power, not really our enemy. Could probably care less in many ways about our existence. You can't negotiate. There isn't going to be a bargaining table where we sit down and say, would you settle for 2 degrees? I mean, it just doesn't work like that. It's chemistry and physics, and we have to accept that fact. And essentially, as David Brower once said, that we're at war with Mother Nature, and unfortunately, we're winning. And if that war metaphor applies, then our only real option is unconditional surrender. You cannot win in a war with nature. It makes no sense, that concept. So there's some good news. The technology for making this transition is available. It's incredible just in the space of my own career. When we first started looking at what a low carbon future might look like in the early 1980s, I guess, was when I did some of my first scenario work. We knew you could make electricity with photovoltaic cells, but if we'd put a significant amount of it into our scenarios, we would have been laughed out of the room. Same was true for wind power. Electric vehicles were really not an option either. So there's been a tremendous amount. The heat pump was not even on our radar. So there's been a tremendous amount of technological progress, which is going to help us, or which has the potential to help us if we're smart enough to use it, which does not include tearing down and canceling wind plants that are already built. I mean, how stupid is that? Secondly, and this is really important, especially in the context of this point about how critical the leadership of local agents like yourselves and local governments is going to be in this transition. The co-benefits are often of much greater value than the climate mitigation itself. When you reduce, I mean, those of you who have driven in electric cars, I think would probably agree, it's a better ride. Those of you who have had the fortune to work in green buildings know that they're healthier and more comfortable places, and the people that work in them are more productive. Those economies that are embracing rather than rejecting the new economic opportunities in clean energy and clean tech are finding that it's putting them at the forefront of competitiveness and economic success for the 21st century. The list goes on. The co-benefits are actually the key in many ways to increasing the pace at which this transition moves forward. It's also going to take a huge workforce, and that's not actually a bad thing. I was reading just today about how the Community Benefits Organization in the city of Toronto has banded together with the construction trades unions in the city and other key stakeholders to develop an apprenticeship training program for unemployed people in Toronto to become skilled at building up the new buildings and the new infrastructure that we need for the low carbon future. We can put everybody to work, and we probably are going to have to put everybody to work to get through this. And it's a wide spectrum of skilled, semi-skilled, and highly skilled labor that's required. And the jobs get created, unlike the old energy system where all the jobs are at the other end of the pipeline or the other end of the transmission line. The employment and the activity for making the transition to a more distributed energy future happens in every community where fuel and electricity are being used. In other words, everywhere. And so it's a very good news story, or should be a very good news story from the point of view of healthy distributed economic activity and employment. Also, perhaps by serendipity, the infrastructure renewal that we are now faced with as the infrastructure that was built up in the 1970s and 80s to service the baby boomer generation as it went through, it's all 50 years old now. And there's a huge requirement that cannot be indefinitely postponed, even though we have been postponing it, to renew that infrastructure. And this is an historic opportunity to build it, rebuild it, and repair it for a more resilient and for a low carbon future. I'll speed up here because I got to get to electricity. You're probably wondering if you're at the right webinar. There's other things going on. Some of them are going to help, some are not. The world is in a very, very state of turmoil, you might say, right now. Sometimes these things help. The war in Ukraine actually sped up the resolve of European nations to make themselves independent of fossil fuel use. So you never really know how some of these other geopolitical and other trends are going to affect the transition, but they are going to affect it. It's capital intensive, but so what? I don't understand why this is an issue. When did we ever shy away from things because they were capital intensive? It didn't stop us from building the railroad or the highway system or the oil sands or all of the other infrastructure that we've got. We found ways to spread out the capital investments required so that they could be paid back over long periods of time. in a way that spread the costs out for everybody, and so the burden was not too much to bear, and so that access to the benefits of those investments could be equitably and widely shared in the society. I mean, we do that all the time. We just have to get on with it with regard to these big capital intensive transitions that are required to get off fossil fuels. We need innovation and financing in business strategies. And when it comes to Ontario's electricity sector, there's no better illustration of the problem that we have with institutions and ways of financing things that are completely no longer fit for purpose in terms of the challenges that we're facing. You know, these are basically institutional structures that were conceived of and developed over 100 years ago, and they're not working for us. Of course, education and climate literacy are important. Everything from webinars like this to education in the schools. Anything and everything that can be done. I'm thinking of the nature walks that Rick Beaver does in my area, for example. Every action that anybody can take to help children especially connect with the land, to understand the relationship and the interdependence that we have with the natural world around us will help speed this transition. Low carbon solutions do vary according to local circumstances, and local agency and capacity is therefore absolutely critical for getting through this. Yeah, and we've got a problem with our institutions, as I mentioned a moment ago, slowing us down at a time when we really need them to be helping us speed up. All right, with all of that said, we come to the year 2023. The Ford government asked the independent electricity system operator to take a look at what the electricity would look like in a decarbonized Ontario future. They came back with a report called the Pathway Decarbonization Study. I believe it's what the acronym PDS stands for. It said, well, the capacity would have to more than double from 42 gigawatts, and 42 gigawatts, that's 42,000 megawatts. Okay, that's a lot. And they're saying that's going to have to go to 88 gigawatts by 2050. And when you add in the fact that there will be some retirements of existing capacity, that means we got to build 69,000 gigawatts of new electricity capacity. The cost? Oh yes, and then basically they end up with an all of the above sort of approach, at least when it comes to centralized solutions. Lots of new nuclear, long duration storage, new hydro facilities, especially in Northern Ontario, a complete virtually doubling of the long distance transmission system to accommodate all of this power, which is now going to be flowing from these large centralized generating sites to the communities in Ontario. And the cost, $375 to $425 billion by 2050. Let me just tell you a little bit about, I've been here before, so I'm a little skeptical whenever I hear the electricity planners saying we have to double the system or we have to triple the system. When I got involved, and my first involvement with the Ontario electricity planning system was in 1976, the Ontario Hydro tabled a long-range plan. The Conservative government, the Bill Davis government, the treasurer was a man named Darcy McHugh, a hardware store owner from Chatham, Ontario, I believe, basically freaked out. Hydro was saying we need, by the early 2000s, 24 new nuclear reactors post-Arlington, 18 coal-fired generators, big ones, you know, they're really big 600-700 megawatt coal generators. None of it was ever built. The government basically, as I said, freaked out, not so much at the environmental implications, although that's what got some of us worried, or just the plain unsustainability of the whole vision, which went on after the early 2000s to recommend yet another 24 nuclear plants and another 18 coal-fired plants. None of that was ever built. Not one of those plants was ever built. And the gap that they said would develop if they didn't build it is larger than the total demand for electricity today, almost 50 years later. So then in 1989, they came back and they said, okay, electricity is not going to grow quite as much as we thought it was 10 years ago, but it is going to grow probably at 2.5% per year, since that's what we think the economy is going to grow at. And if the economy grows, the electricity supply has to grow. They hadn't learned that that was not true. And they said, we're going to have a gap by 2005 of 9,700 megawatts. And it's going to be 21,000 megawatts by 2014. So they put a big plan on the table, more nukes, more coal, all of that. An environmental assessment commenced, but it was canceled when Hydro withdrew the plan in 1991. The gap never materialized. None of the plants were ever built. Then in 2005, 2007, at that time I was a vice president of ICF, and the Ontario Power Authority had just been set up, and they were projecting a gap by 2010, 163 terawatt hour demand by 2010, growing to 169 terawatt hours by 2015. Today, by the way, it's somewhere around 136, growing to 177 by 2020. So they expedited the approval of those gas plants. The gap never materialized. And as I said, the demand is hovering. It says here around 150 terawatt hours, but it's actually more like 140, depending on how you count all the rooftop solar and so on. So we've had a history in this province, what I call gapology, where a forecast gets put forward suggesting that we've got to right away start building like there's no tomorrow if we're going to keep the lights on. And then the demand doesn't materialize because the forecast was wrong. So we come now to this latest forecast from the IESO, again saying that the grid is going to have to double, maybe triple, in order to decarbonize and satisfy the electrification of cars and the electrification of heat with heat pumps and so on. And therefore, we better start building nukes right away, because we're going to need all of that power. Meanwhile, since the climate, and this is where the electricity story and the climate change story really start to bump into each other, for about the past 20 or 25 years, there has been a growing body of local action on climate change, including by municipal governments, including by many, many municipalities in Ontario, but also all around the world, who have taken it upon themselves to ask the question, how can we make a transition in our community to a low carbon future? And when they do that, yes, they look at electrification of transportation. And yes, they look at heat pumps to provide heat in their buildings, but they do it in a broad context that's looking at the whole system and how efficient the buildings could be, and what role energy conservation could play, and how they can develop their community in a way that minimizes the need for automobile travel and maximizes the ease and convenience of transit, and so on and so forth. And when these communities, and as I said, there's a lot of these plans now, and I've been involved in quite a few of these, because I got involved in the local climate action field in the early 1990s when ICLEI, the International Council for Local Environmental Initiatives, was first starting up. And there's a whole body of expertise and understanding that has gradually been building up in many, not all, but in many city halls and town halls across Ontario, that has a different view of how we can get through this transition. And in a presentation that a colleague of mine and I made recently, we added up all of the electricity consumption in all of the local action plans that we could pull together in Ontario out to the year 2050. And yes, it adds up to growth in the electricity consumption. But it doesn't get even to 1.5 times the size of the current grid, never mind doubling or tripling. It looks a lot more like 1% per year than the 2 to 3% that we're seeing coming out of the IESO and the Canadian Energy Regulator as well. And the reason for this, let me just give you a couple of examples. I could go on and on about this because we're getting into the weeds of the technical area that I work on. But here's an interesting sort of illustration of the kinds of reasons why electrification doesn't necessarily bring with it an increase in electricity consumption on a very large scale. In the top of the slide, here we have a neighborhood represented by 4 houses. 3 of them are heated with gas, the blue ones, and 1 is heated with electricity. So this would be characteristic of a province that had 25% of its space heat provided with electricity, which is a bit high for Ontario. Ontario's around 17%, I think, but it's low for Nova Scotia or British Columbia or Manitoba. It's very low for Quebec, where 80% of space heat is coming from electricity. So but this is, for purposes of the thought experiment, 25%. Each house has got 1 car. And I've added up the energy use using typical consumption numbers for both the houses and the cars, and assuming typical efficiency levels for the gas furnace and so on. And if the grid that's providing the electricity, which adds up to about 200 units in our starting case, our before case, if you like, if that grid has an emission intensity of 100 grams per kilowatt hour, which is above where Ontario is at now. In fact, Ontario is quite low at the moment, but it's going up. Ontario's at about 25 or 30. Alberta's at about 600. That gives you a sense. So 100 is a relatively low grid intensity, but not as low as the hydro provinces and not as low as where Ontario is right now, although they seem determined to increase the carbon intensity of our grid with the decisions that they're making. The total emissions from this neighborhood of 4 houses, 45 tons of CO2 annually. And even if the grid was carbon-free, because of the emissions from those vehicles, you would still have 40 tons, because most of those 45 tons are coming from the tailpipes of those 4 cars. In the bottom of the chart, same 4 houses, the 3 gas houses have now been converted to heat pumps at 2.6 or 260% seasonal coefficient of performance. They've had some efficiency improvements, nothing that dramatic, actually. Heat requirements have been reduced to 60 gigajoules. It's a fairly deep retrofit, but it's still over twice what the passive house standard would be for retrofits. And there's been a modest 20% improvement in lights and appliance efficiency. That's a no-brainer. That'll just happen due to turnover. And they've all got electric cars now at 20 kilowatt hours per 100 kilometers instead of the gas guzzlers. And 2 of the homes have got solar panels that generate 4,000 kilowatt hours a year. So fairly small systems. I have one on my roof and I get about 3,000, and it's quite a small system. So the total grid electricity use is now 191 gigajoules. It's gone down. We've electrified 3 of these gas homes, and our total consumption of electricity is down. We have electrified the cars because of the much, much greater efficiency that electrification brings to these end uses. It's not necessary in this particular case, and there's many, as I said, many other examples of this, where the transition to electricity, if it's done cleverly, if it's done in concert with efficiency and conservation and so on, it does not necessarily have to blow the grid, as it were. So in the scenario that we now have, if the grid was still up at 100 grams per kilowatt hours, you would be left with 5 tons of emissions instead of 45. And if the grid was carbon-free, then that bottom scenario is a carbon-free neighborhood. And there are other examples of this. And I'm going to speed up now because I'm conscious of the time. But here's an example that illustrates some analysis that we did of an office building in Ontario, a medium-sized 30,000 square meter office building. On the left is the baseline gas consumption and the baseline electricity consumption. And the electricity consumption is broken down into the various end uses, lighting and plug load and fans and pumps and so on. On the right is the energy use after a retrofit and a conversion from gas to electricity. So all that's left is electricity use. There is no more gas use because you've converted to heat pump technology. Electricity use is up, but look by how much. It's quite modest. It's not a doubling. It's not a tripling. It's a much more modest increase that results when you take a whole system approach and when you do things cleverly. And when you look at the system, the way local governments have been doing as a total system, and not just from the point of view of a narrow focus on electricity supply and demand. This is an even more dramatic case from Quebec, where electricity consumption actually goes down after conversion. And by the way, electricity is not growing. It's interesting. I put this graph up on my LinkedIn page last week, thinking, oh, this is kind of interesting. The summer's over. Let's see what's happened to electricity consumption in Ontario for the year that ended September 13th, compared to the last 20 years for the years that ended on September 13th. And it's actually down compared to last year. And over the last 20 years, it's down like 12 or 14%, even though population is up by over 20% and economic output is up by 40%. So this is what's actually happening with the grid compared to these arm-waving arguments that the sky is going to fall if we don't immediately double or triple the amount of electricity generating capacity that we have. And by the way, this graph shows what's happening with peak demand. Very similar drop, percentage terms, a little more volatile for reasons that have to do with weather and so on. Finally, I want to, not finally, but almost finally, I want to say a little bit about the international context. This is the growth in clean energy broken down by, this is from Bloomberg, broken down by some of the leading technologies. So the yellow is renewable energy, renewable electricity mainly. The green is the electric vehicle growth. And you can see that even throughout, in fact, even especially throughout the pandemic, we continue to see global growth outstripping economic growth by far in these clean technologies. It's interesting also to look at the way it breaks down internationally. The red is Asia and China. The green is Europe and Mideast and Africa. And the blue is Canada and the United States and the Americas in general. One of the reasons I think that one of the risks that we face here in Canada and North America generally is this is happening. This transition is accelerating in Europe. It's accelerating in Asia. It's driving the economic transition that's going on. It's renewing communities. It's revitalizing industry in a way that's not yet happening here. And if we don't get on with it, we run the risk of becoming a real backwater in the 21st century, because we won't be making the things, the products, and the services that the world is going to be looking for in order to reestablish a more sustainable relationship with the ecological environment in which it's all embedded. The IEA is projecting that growth in these technologies will be 4 times faster than world economic growth throughout this 2020s. So, and we at Corporate Knights have been looking at the performance of companies that make these things. And I could do a whole talk on just on this graph, but the orange line at the top is an index, and we now have this in this is not a commercial by any means, but there is a McKinsey investment market fund, market ETF, which is based on this index that we've developed by identifying the leading companies in terms of sustainability without any regard to their financial performance. But when we're finished and we've identified these leading companies in terms of who's making the electric cars, who's making the smart buildings, who's developing the renewable electricity resources and so on, we find that these companies are outperforming the Morgan Stanley index, the Dow Jones index, and other standard global indices of market capitalization in the world. This is where the action is, in other words. So this transition that I talked about right at the top of my remarks this evening it's underway. And this is actually fairly hopeful. And there's a tremendous amount of momentum building behind it. And it's not to say that it's perfect and there aren't going to be problems. I mean, after all, these companies are every bit as much interested in shareholder returns as companies that are making oil and gas. And all the issues that come with that singular focus will continue to plague us. But they're making electric cars instead of fossil cars. They're making windmills and solar panels instead of nuclear plants and fossil fuel generators. And so we are not going to get out of this, I don't think, bind that we've got ourselves into without the organizational and technological capacity of these very large corporate organizations. Love them or hate them, they can accomplish things on a scale which would be difficult for other institutions to copy. Finally, just a word about local agency. We cannot get through this without the active engagement of local governments. Local governments actually largely determine the level of greenhouse gas emissions in the society. I mentioned co-benefits earlier. The pursuit of emission reduction and other GHG mitigation strategies brings multiple benefits to communities. That's what's driving all of the money that's being spent on these analyses and strategies and all of the investments that are flowing and all of the programs that are coming out of organizations like the Federation of Canadian Municipalities to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. These investments make better communities, economically, public health, interconnectivity, enhanced livability. All of these indicators tick up when you tackle the greenhouse gas mitigation challenge. There's a lot of variation from one community to the next. I won't dwell on this point, but it does mean that we need to have literacy, if you like, climate literacy at every level, right down to the household level and all the way up to town hall and city hall. I mentioned a moment ago, local governments influence emissions and the scope for reductions in so many ways. This is just a list of some of them, and the list goes on. The problem, when you talk to mayors, including some local mayors in this area, they will say, oh, we don't get, our citizens are not bugging us about climate change. Now, this is not true everywhere, but it's true in my town, and it's true in other towns. The problem is not that the public doesn't care about climate change, although local officials will sometimes interpret it that way. The problem is that climate change is still not sufficiently understood as a local issue and as a problem that can be and must be addressed with local agency. It's local communities that will feel the brunt of the floods and the storms and the fires, and it's local communities and local agency that will turn this around. Just as our electricity system in this province started out over 100 years ago as the result of the initiatives and the leadership that came from the grassroots in this province. The establishment of public power in Ontario was largely brought about by champions of municipal and local government issues. It was about streetcars and it was about streetlights initially. And the principle that the power of Niagara should be available to all of the citizens of Ontario on an equitable basis, and not just to the business interests who at the time were trying to establish a much narrower private control over that resource. The system has evolved a lot since then, and it's become largely privatized, and it's been restructured in the last couple of decades. And it's really no longer working in the interests of the people of Ontario. And if you look at the IESO decarbonization scenario and compare it to the type of future we would get by implementing those local government climate action plans, it's night and day. In so many ways, the bottom-up community-based strategies for dealing with this problem, with distributed solar and wind, with microgrids, with built-out electric vehicle charging, with virtual power plant technology, all of those things yield a low-carbon future, which is cheaper, which is more community-friendly, and which is much more aligned with the historical principle which has guided historically electricity development in this province, that it should be there to serve the communities and the municipalities and the people of Ontario. We've got to take that back. And I know that just looking at the list of participants here this evening, you folks are engaged in 100 different and effective ways at making that happen. So I applaud you for those efforts, and I hope that my comments over the last hour have provided some useful information and perspective on this fight that we're all engaged in which I think we're going to win, because the momentum that's building behind this transition and the logic of going in this direction is just so compelling compared to the dead end, literally, that awaits us if we continue to think that we can get stronger by exhausting ourselves, that we can somehow achieve sustainability by doubling and tripling and going with a model of perpetual growth that completely flies in the face of what we now understand to be the challenge that we face if we want to finally learn how to live in peace, not only with each other, but with our neighbors. And that brings it all back to my opening comments. So perhaps I'll just close the circle and leave it at that. And thank you so much for inviting me this evening. I appreciate your indulgence and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Ralph, for your presentation. Every time I listen to you, I learn a great deal new, and I appreciate you taking the time to walk through this. We're going to go to the question period, and I'll just explain what's going to happen. We have 3 people who are going to be posing questions verbally, and everyone else who's participating tonight can put a question to Ralph in the chat, and we will try to get to those, as many of those as possible. And I'll ask you to be brief in your question, and you can ask more than one question, but submit them separately, and we'll ask Ralph to deal with them. Before I go to those 3 people, I'd just like to acknowledge the presence of my friend Vic Beaver tonight of Alderville First Nations. He's an educator, an elder, an environmentalist, and an artist. And we were on that nature walk this weekend, and Rick, I managed to slow the young people down so we could keep up with them. So welcome, Rick. I'm going to go to Angela Bischoff for the first question.
Thank you so much, Ralph. That was so inspiring. It's hopeful. It really gives me hope. I've like you've given such a clear indication that the world really is moving to a renewable future. Ontario, is really resisting that direction, going so far as to even rip out and cancel existing contracts with renewable energy producers. And now they're about to spend, certainly over $100 billion on new nuclear reactors, extending and locking us in, for decades into these really high cost projects. Same thing with gas. And like, I get that local communities are key to fighting it. We just saw in Thorold yesterday, the community rose up against a new gas expansion. They were smart, they were sophisticated, they did door-to-door leaflet distribution, they got people out to the council meeting, and even the climate deniers on council supported the citizens and said no to a new gas plant. So I get that that is really key. But when these large companies are spending like millions of dollars, OPG, Bruce Power, Enbridge, they're spending so much money. It's so hard for local communities or organizations to come up against that kind of propaganda machine. And how do we organize, like, to prevent these huge mega projects? Once they start building these projects, then we're locked in. Meanwhile, the whole rest of the world is like going in a different direction. And, aside from the next election when we're going to get maybe a new government in, like, how do we fight these? Like, they're monopolies. The nuclear industry gets these contracts with no bidding process. So I guess I'm going to the politics of it and the psychology of how do we persuade the public and get them on side and to really engage in our democracy.
Ralph, you're muted.
Yeah, I mean, there are probably about 100 people who have more political strategy savvy than I do on the call this evening. But for me, one of the interesting things about that Thorold decision was that it came out of rural, southwestern Ontario, which is conservative heartland. And I think that the more we are able, one of the reasons that I've always felt that developing these plans at local level and developing literacy and understanding with local politicians, as well as other people in communities. I spoke to my local Rotary Club not too long ago just for that reason. The more that opinion leaders and thought leaders in Main Street, small town Ontario start to realize that this is not the way we need to go, I think the better chance we may have of seeing that have some kind of an impact on this particular government, or on any government for that matter, is developing that grassroots understanding that there is a more sustainable option available. I mean, the nuclear investments are particularly distressing because they're so expensive. They won't help us in the 2020s. You can't possibly design and build them quick enough. They're not just new reactors. They're boiling water reactors. They're American designed. They're not natural uranium, which is what Canada has always sort of prided itself on avoiding, is the enriched uranium option. These are going to be enriched uranium reactors with boiling, not pressurized water, which introduces a whole new set of safety issues. On-power refueling, another great Canadian innovation, not going to have that. They're not small, by the way. They're like, they call them small modular reactors. It drives me crazy. I can't bring myself to use the term. I've started calling them poodles because it's just as accurate. These are big, big machines. They're very expensive. They've never been licensed anywhere in Canada or anywhere else. This is the first one. And one can't help but feel that Ontario is being used as a proving ground, if you like, by General Electric for seeing whether they can build one of these things in a jurisdiction where the regulatory oversight doesn't seem to be as much of a barrier, and where the citizen outcry might not be as strong as it would be if they tried to do this in their home country of the United States. So I'm feeling like we're really getting taken for a ride on these big new boiling water enriched uranium reactors at the Darlington site. Never mind the prospect of 4 new giant reactors at Bruce that they're talking about, which again, will very, very unlikely those will be Canadian nuclear technology either. So we're going down a road that involves a lot of unprecedents. You know, we've never licensed these. We have no familiarity with this technology, no experience with it. They're not the most popular. Boiling water reactors are not the most popular. The other thing that bothers me, and I'll just say this because we don't want to go on. We're going to have a whole other session about the nuclear option that Angela's organizing in October, later in October. But when you read the design document for these new reactors at Darlington, it starts right off by saying the key thing that's going to drive the design of these reactors is keeping the costs down. Because the only way that nuclear, which right now is about 4 or 5 times more expensive than solar and wind per kilowatt of capacity, the only way that it's going to be competitive is if they can, or even pretend to be close to being competitive, is to reduce the cost by at least a factor of 3. So all of their design efforts are focused on that objective. And I know from my own experience years ago, both in the nuclear industry and as a critic of the nuclear industry, that the worst combination possible is a cost-cutting pressure when you're designing a nuclear reactor. I mean, it's not a good combination because decisions start to be made not on the basis of safety. They're basically will be made on the basis of what's the cheapest way that we can satisfy the regulations that we have to conform to. And yeah, it's not likely to end very well.
I believe the chat is disabled for participants.
Yeah, I haven't been able to see it or participate in it.
What? No, it's
okay
functioning.
now.
Yeah,
it's okay
yeah.
now.
Okay.
Okay, there we go.
So thank you, Ralph. I'm going to go to my colleague, Ann Pohl, who has been one of the leaders of the environmental movement on the fight against nuclear growth in Eastern Ontario. Ann?
Ralph, I really enjoyed your summary there. I've learned and said all the same things that you just said in a couple of minutes, but you said it so well. So, I live 60 kilometers from where CNL is located in Chalk River and AECL. And of course, one of our major concerns here is the nuclear waste issue. But we also join in with other chapters of the Council of Canadians across the country and being concerned about the SMRs and all of the issues that you just raised. I'm tempted, because we're in the middle of building a Climate Matters campaign. I'm tempted to ask you for references, or anybody for references, for what local municipalities can do, because CNL has basically got so much of this county of the Ottawa Valley by the throat, and it's almost impossible to talk about climate issues without getting just buried in the greenwashing of how more nuclear is the real solution to the climate issue. And it's very hard to speak against it because it's the best employer, the best private employer in the area. So we're really in a bind on how we tackle that issue, and we keep going at it though, and have started working with First Nations. So, but dealing with it, one of the things that really has surfaced for me is that what's needed is systemic change. Dealing with the actual projects like the near surface disposal facility or the underground deposit areas or whatever. The real issue is how the CNSC functions, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission functions. And so I've been working with people like Bob and other people around throughout the council to get the national office on board for building a campaign to demand better accountability and responsibility and a barrier wall from industry for the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. And I'm just interested in any of the thoughts that you might have about that topic.
I don't know. I'm tempted to defer to Angela, or maybe there's others on the call that have been more actively engaged with the nuclear industry in recent years. It does seem like the licensing or the safety agency in Canada has become even more of a cheerleader for the industry than it used to be, and that's disturbing. In terms of the first part of your question, I guess I would just reiterate the importance of developing local initiatives to mitigate emissions, because whether it's a local building retrofit or local program or local social housing that's zero emission, or a push to get electric vehicle charging infrastructure in place where it's needed, or a focus on any other aspect of the community's greenhouse gas profile. What happens, and I've seen this literally 1,000 times now, is that as communities begin to take initiatives at addressing climate change and start to see the benefits that flow from the types of things that local governments and local non-governmental organizations can do on their own, and all of the other benefits that flow to the community, it builds momentum, and it builds it also has the effect of undercutting the forecast demand growth on which the growth of the central power plant and the nuclear power plant enterprise is predicated, and on which it depends. Growth in electricity is going nowhere right now in Ontario. They keep saying it's going to shoot up, but it never shoots up. And the longer that we can continue to keep downward pressure on the growth of electricity consumption by electrifying in smart ways and reducing demand for fossil fuels in our community at the same time, the more difficult it's going to be for that old system to prevail. As far as the specifics of what local governments can do, there are a lot of people out there, and there are organizations like the Clean Air Partnership out of Toronto. There are networks of local government officials as well as local NGOs that have been working on this problem in some cases for 30 or 40 years. So there's a rich body of both peer support and established case studies and examples of what works that you can tap into. And I'd be happy to send you some initial contacts that would open the door to that world if you're not already there.
Thanks, Ralph. I'm going to go to Martin Bush, my colleague on the organizing team. Martin?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Ralph, that's really good. Now, my question concerns the recent the clean electricity regulations, which sounds really good. They imposed the limit, or proposing a limit, what they're calling prohibition, of 30 grams per kilowatt hour, which, as you mentioned, the Europeans are cut it back to about 100. So it all sounds good, but there's just so many exemptions and concessions and all sorts of fudge factors that just allow, particularly gas-fired power generation, to keep going. These limits only come in 2035, and then there's this idea of the end of proposed life, which gives you a 20-year lifetime for, let's say, a gas-powered generating station, developed in the last few years. So essentially, even though it sounds great, clean electricity, the legislation is just full of loopholes, and it just, that was just. So the question is, does corporate knights have a position on this? Because the government is asking for, feedback and for us to get back to them with the way we see the legislation and what we propose. So that's the question. Corporate Lights, I'm sure, has a position on this. So I'm just asking you if you could just outline that. It'd be interesting for me.
Specifically on the clean energy regulations?
Clean electricity regulations.
Clean electricity regulations. I'm not sure that we do. We should. It would align with yours. Corporate Knights is not an advocacy organization primarily, although it does see itself as an impact organization. And while we do a disproportionate amount of our analysis and work in Canada, we're also a global organization in terms of the focus of our research. But I think that from what I've gathered, I'm just not an expert on the clean electricity regulations, so I should probably not comment further. The comments I've heard align with what you said. They seem good on the surface, but the devil seems to be in the details.
Okay. Thank you, Rob. Martin, did you have a follow-up on that, or did you want to make a statement that might assist us to finish this section?
Well, only that, SCAN is proposing that we have, position, which I think is important. I think the other organizations and agencies should also have a position as well. And it doesn't, if each organization has a sort of conflicting idea, some people are going to say, oh, shut them all down by 2030. This is a gas plant. Others are going to say, yes, no, we need to keep it going. I mean, what are we going to do if the electricity doubles, and how are we going to manage? So we're looking for a coherent strategy and approach to get back to the government and say, okay, these are the environmental organizations in Ontario, and perhaps wider Atlantic Canada. We might bring those guys in as well. And there is a consensus, a very strong point of view that this is what we should be doing when it comes to clean electricity regulations. And there are major changes that need to be made in the proposed legislation. So I think that's what we're after.
I think Martin's presenting a challenge to all of us and our connections to look at that a lot more carefully. Thank you, Martin. We're now going to go to questions from the chat. My colleague Lorna, who chair of the tech team, will present those questions, and Ralph, feel free to answer any of those questions or refer them if you think someone else should be dealing with them.
Thanks,
yeah,
Bob.
there's a lot of knowledge in the group here this evening. So I hope people will raise their hands if they want to contribute to the response to some of these.
No, we've decided to do it all through the chat. So
Yeah,
I
okay.
made a list of the questions, and I will ask them, and you may respond. So Ron Corkum has asked, what are the barriers to energy storage backup for wind and solar?
So am I to respond to that?
Yes,
Yes.
that's the question.
Oh, I see. Okay. The barriers to, there's so many different levels one can address that at, but essentially all of these new technologies suffer from a lack of financing infrastructure, which is in place for, the established fuel and electricity suppliers. So a lot of this is being slowed down by a lack of more aggressive financing approaches to these, because these are capital and these are things you pay for them up front, and then they don't cost much after that. And frankly, a lot of our oil and gas resources are like that as well. Certainly our electricity supply system is like that. These nuclear plants cost billions and billions of dollars, and yet somehow we build them. So we need a lot of innovation focused on financing these things so that the costs get spread out the same way we spread out the costs for the big supply side projects. It's also, we have never in history seen the cost, I should say, of any energy technology come down as quickly and as steeply as we have seen it come down for wind and solar and storage in the last 10 years. It's phenomenal. And so in some ways, the deployment has to catch up with the sudden availability of these reasonably priced technologies. Yeah, and I think there's also a capacity issue just in terms of the industry that's available and experienced in installing these systems.
Thanks, Ralph. Lorna?
Yep, next question from Rick Beaver. The investments of shareholders and powerful proponents of economic gain is ingrained and drives growth for growth's sake. Do you have any ideas on how this can be moderated?
Ralph?
Well, yeah, might be a good point to just remind ourselves that we are facing an emergency with respect to climate change. We know what an emergency response looks like. We saw it with COVID. And even though we may have declared, various levels of government have declared a climate emergency, we are not mobilizing investment at the levels that are needed to really bend that emissions curve. We've done fairly detailed analysis of where the money needs to be spent. We're just launching another project on this. The government has its own number. The Royal Bank came out with a number last year, and they all tend to say that if you really want to address this problem, the level of investment probably needs to be somewhere around $125 billion per year for the next 10 years. It's less, by the way, than the annual expenditure responding to COVID, but it's a lot of money. It's several percent of Canada's GDP. I don't think it's going to happen without the public investor taking a leadership role. I think that the only way that we could, for example, get the retrofits done in this country at a speed and a scale that's necessary to respond to climate change is to get government financing into the picture. And I don't mean government spending. This is all money that would come back to the government, but they're especially the federal government, they're in the most advantageous position for those aspects of the transition that are stuck because of the investment not being attractive enough to the private sector. That's the level of government that has the most power for unlocking those log jams. And we've seen it before. Typically during wartime, we see it, but we also saw it during COVID, where sovereign financing and investment can really accelerate the transition. There are other aspects of the transition, the electric vehicle transition, for example, that are accelerating at quite actually faster than most of us predicted would be possible 2 or 3 years ago. And that's mostly being driven at this point by private investment, as is the smart building sector growth rates, as is the renewable electricity growth rates. So I'm not sure that growth for growth's sake is a problem for sure, but large corporate investors are all over this clean energy transition. Naturally, they are giving priority to the most profitable segments, as you would expect them to, and also the ones that are clearly most mature in terms of technological readiness. And so it's the renewable electricity and the electric vehicles, and to a certain extent, the plant-based protein industry is growing like gangbusters, as is the some other elements of the transition. But in those areas where things need a push, I think it's going to take the public investment to step in. And we're doing some of that in Canada through the Infrastructure Bank. I don't think we're seeing any leadership at all from our government here in Ontario. Municipal governments could be doing more, but they need to have the ability to do the kind of debt financing that would be involved, for example, in massive building retrofit programs in their communities. So there are some issues that need to be addressed in terms of the mandate and the regulatory environment in which local governments operate that would give them more freedom to address this problem in their own communities.
Thanks, Ralph. And of course, Seth Klein has made the point of the need for government investment on the scale that was done during World War II. I'm sure many people are familiar with that, and there certainly hasn't been much political response to it. Lorna?
Do we have time for one more?
Let's take one more quick question. If people could be patient, I think we've got some things we need to do, and I know we're rushing things. One
Okay,
more
well,
question.
Michael Barclay has asked, do you know if the modeling of power consumption in the future accounts for massive population growth from immigration and refugees?
Well, yes, I mean, the power planning exercise always starts with a forecast of population growth, which takes into account stated immigration targets. It's a really good question because immigrants come into the economy as fully fledged consumers, unlike babies, which don't have the same impact on resource consumption initially in the first few years of their life. When a family of adults or a family with adults and children moves into the country, it has an immediate undamped impact on the demand for fuel and electricity and other resources, but it is taken into account in energy planning.
Thank you very much, Ralph, for your presentation and for your responses to questions. We will be keeping the record of all questions and the chat, and we will do our best to try to find the right way to address those questions and to engage in future activity. We're going to move, as you and I talked about, the need for action. I'm going to ask Lynn Adamson, a member of the organizing committee, one of the OCEC co-chairs and a SCAN member, to lead that section. Lynn?
Thank you. And so now we come to action. All of this wonderful learning that we've had tonight, thanks to Ralph Torrie and our organizing team, must lead to action if we are to change the energy future in this province. Now, just this past weekend, we've seen tremendous organizing success in dozens of demonstrations held around the province, across the country, and globally. Thousands turned out at Queen's Park on Saturday to send the message, and as many as 600,000 around the world, with 75,000 in New York City. Here in Ontario, we've just learned of the success of the Thorold Council rejecting a gas plant unanimously. That is an important step, and we need to support it. And it was won through door-to-door work, letters, deputations. The citizens' voice was crucial to this victory. And we must make sure the province follows through on its promise to respect municipalities' right to say no. So I'm going to copy in the chat just a link that you can go to. I'm going to pop a few links in here, and I'm also just going to try and give a follow-up letter so that we can follow up, because knowing what needs to happen for the energy future in the province is not going to get us that future without organizing. Now, we know that Colombia, which is an oil-producing nation, has just recently joined Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance and has said publicly we have to get off fossil fuels. California recently endorsed the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, and Governor Newsom today was at the UN Climate Ambition Summit, directly calling out the role of fossil fuels and starting a lawsuit against the fossil fuel companies. Ecuador voted to protect an area of the Amazon. And in Toronto, we're going to have a carbon budget for the first time in our next budget. And we've got really strong building emissions standards. In Nanaimo has said no new gas in new homes as of 2024. So there's all these things that can happen across the country or in our local areas, but we need to make sure that we have the local organizing, we have the local climate plans. Ralph showed us the projections based on the climate plans that are there. So my cat is really interested in being part of tonight. Anyways, we can build this network across the province where we can build power, coordinate our efforts. So please join one of the sponsoring organizations or both. Seniors for Climate Action Now and Ontario Climate Emergency Campaign, OCEC, Ontario Climate Emergency Campaign, is for both individuals and groups. And there's a number of events that we can be part of in the next coming weeks. And I'll just mention a few of them and send the rest in our follow-up letter. But okay, so we have a lobby day. This is Citizens Climate Lobby, and some of our other groups are involved in a provincial lobby breakfast at Queen's Park on September 26th, 7:30 to 9 in the morning. It involves training on Monday night, and registration is open until noon tomorrow. So it's there's a few spots left. And if you can join us for that, please do. I'll put the link in the chat for that breakfast. So just going in there now. And the information is all there if you click on it. And there's a webinar on Friday that Group of 78 is doing on how municipalities can lead the way on climate actions. And there's the clean electricity regulations have a comment period going till November 2nd. And David Suzuki and other organizations have email letters that you can sign. So I'm going to pop a couple of those actions in the chat. There's going to be a Just Transition, a day of action, November 4th, and there's a planning call for that actually tomorrow night. People are welcome to get involved in that. And next week, the Grassy Narrows and 4 other Indigenous nations are holding a March for the Land, Wednesday, September 27th, 12 noon at Grange Park to Queen's Park. And I'll put the registration link there. We in October, I'll just mention 2 very briefly. There's October 4th call is having a climate learning meeting. That's Climate Action for Lifelong Learners. Also on the same theme, Powering Ontario's Future, is our energy plan design for the 21st century. So please contact call for more details. I'll put the email address there, or if someone has the link, we can put it there for that webinar. And then October 14th, some of you may have been at the Harvest Ontario Walk last year that Environmental Defence organized to protect the Greenbelt and oppose Highway 413. And those threats have even grown this year, but you've also seen the power of citizen pushback. It's absolutely incredible how much progress has been made since the Auditor General's report was put out there, and there continue to be actions happening continuously to challenge the province about that. So we must not give up just because we have a province that's really difficult to deal with. We need to keep moving forward, and October 14th will be the second Harvest Ontario Walk, and I'll put in the link for that. And there's just a couple of other links which have to do with the bold emissions cap that we need to call for federally, and efficiency for all, programs for low-income Canadians, barrier-free programs to get efficient homes and affordable energy out to everyone in our community. So there are many strategies. The important thing is to take action, and to take action today, and to invite others in our circle to join. We have more than 250 organizations as members of the Ontario Climate Emergency Campaign. This includes students, faith groups, labor and community organizations. So we need to broaden out in this way in order to build power and make the difference to the future. And I know that we can do it. So I'll pop those other links in the chat and pass things over. The closing.
Thank you, Lynn. I can see I'm going to have to negotiate an 18-hour day so we can do a few of these things.
Yeah, you have to do what you're called to do. I recognize there's too much here for any one person to do. So have a look and see what you're able to do. Some are a quick link and easy to do, and others involve more organizing time. So please see what you feel called to do, what you can do locally, and what you can engage others in your circle, in your community to be part of. Thanks.
Thanks, Lynn, so much. I'll turn things over to Millie.
Great. Thank you so much to everybody. Thank you, Lynn, for that incredibly full menu of options to choose from. All of the pragmatic information and yet the inspiration of, taking what we just learned from Ralph and translating it into action. And of course, a very special thanks to Ralph for giving of your time tonight to share with us such a deeply knowledgeable and hopeful presentation. I'd like to acknowledge our sponsoring organizations. SCAN is a fast-growing climate action group based right here in Ontario. SCAN mobilizes seniors to push for decisive action on the climate emergency and to build a just and equitable economy. And OCEC, as you heard a little bit from Lynn there, is a unique environmental democracy movement comprised of over 285 multi-sector groups that collectively represent over 850,000 Ontarians currently. And OCEC seeks to support, amplify, and coordinate its signatory groups to empower climate action through cooperation and our democratic voice. Thanks also to the entire organizing team, including Bob Garthson, Gail Greer, Martin Bush, Lynn Adamson, David Robertson, and Lorna McHugh for all your excellent and hard work in putting together this incredible program tonight. I'd also like to acknowledge the beautiful song that was contributed by Mary Lynn Hammond, which unfortunately we weren't able to share at the beginning. Maybe Lorna can put it on at the end, I'm not sure. And to recognize Dennis Layton for editing and producing the video that will follow this event, and all registrants will receive a link. And finally, a huge thanks to each and every person in the audience today. We've learned so much, heard some incredible ideas, and engaged in some great discussion. We hope this will inspire each of you to continue pushing for climate action and to join with others in your community to influence and work in solidarity to ensure a just and healthy future for all. We live in a system where the global fossil industry receives $11 million every minute in subsidies. And Canada's big banks are using our money to fund fossil corporations, which then influence our elected governments to continue the flow of fossil fuels, limiting real climate action. So where is our opportunity? And Ralph was so good at pointing this out throughout his talk. The forces to maintain the fossil fuel status quo are incredibly powerful. They're deeply entrenched, but they're also becoming increasingly artificial and contrary to reality. With the price of renewable energy recently becoming cheaper than any fossil fuel prices are skyrocketing and volatile, while the price of renewable energy will continue to fall with increased uptake at scale. And this, of course, stabilizes the cost of living. And the transition to renewables will also avoid the staggering cost of human health and infrastructure damage due to fossil fuel-driven climate change and air pollution. And this, of course, yields massive extra savings, which can then flow into our public services and the supports we all need to thrive. So only 25 fossil companies are responsible for producing over half of all greenhouse gas emissions since 1988, the year we first coined the term climate change. The players who benefit from fossils are undeniably powerful, but they are also very few. While there are billions of us who will benefit from getting off fossil fuels and on to renewable energies. So there is a huge potential power that we have not yet been fully exercising if we stand together. So this is our opportunity to urgently build momentum and take action for the sustainable green energy future we all deserve. So thanks to everyone again for joining, and please do take a moment to complete the evaluation form that you will see as you exit this meeting.
Canada is burning, oh Canada's on fire, but our leaders just aren't learning, though the flames keep shooting higher. Whether government or corporation, all they do is drag their feet. So it's us, the people of this nation, gotta make them feel the heat. 'Cause Canada is burning, Canada's on fire, but our leaders just aren't learning, though the flames keep shooting higher. We could mobilize fast in wartime, the whole country in high gear. So why are we wasting more time now with the fate of the planet so clear? 'Cause Canada is burning, oh Canada's on fire, but our leaders just aren't learning, though the flames keep shooting higher. So think about the next generation and the hell they might go through. Then let the kids be your motivation to do all that you can do. 'Cause Canada is burning, oh Canada's on fire, but our leaders just aren't learning, though the flames keep shooting higher. Oh, Canada is burning, yes, Canada's on fire, but our leaders just aren't learning, though the flames keep shooting higher. Yes, the flames